Let's discuss this current situation in that part of the world with political commentator and analyst, Mr. Jason Unruhe, who is joining us via Skype out of Ontario, to basically, first of all, get his reaction to the latest developments. Jason.
I think at first, very obviously, this is a provocative act by the United States. It's very clear that these are Chinese territorial waters. They have been so for decades, if not, well, frankly, centuries. Now, obviously, anybody who has their own territorial waters is free to have their Navy go anywhere they want in their own waters, which is why it's their own waters. There's nothing wrong here. The United States does the same thing. The U.S. Coast Guard frequently patrols U.S. territorial waters, and nobody has a problem with that. The problem here is the fact that there are resources in the South China Sea, a region which the United States has not had any interest in until it was discovered that there were things like oil and gas, etc. Then all of a sudden the United States claims it to be a disputed territory which many places have a claim over. I mean, this is simply nonsense. It has always been known that this was Chinese territorial waters, but as soon as there's some money to be made off of it, all of a sudden it becomes this kind of controversy which the United States is stirring up in order to try to portray China as some kind of aggressor, that somehow the U.S. or some other country has a right to those resources that are clearly within Chinese territorial waters. Now, of course, China is going to send military ships around its coast. Even if this, let's say that this even wasn't a scientific expedition, China does have a right to patrol its territorial waters using its military force. This is nothing out of the ordinary for any country that has a part of its border connected to a body of water. There's nothing here out of the ordinary. This is completely normal. And the United States is trying to turn this into some kind of provocative action which they can use to point fingers at China in order to further international hostilities at them. And it's very interesting that this comes at a time when the U.S. is currently funding many of the protesters inside of Hong Kong in order to create a destabilizing social situation and economic situation within the country as well. So all of these things do play together, and they don't exist in separate vacuums. They're all part of a larger coordinated effort by the United States to undermine China. Now, this is something the United States has done to many countries around the world, so this is absolutely nothing new. But this particular situation right now, this accusation that China is trying to militarize the sea or somehow doesn't have a right to patrol its own waters, is simply something they're using to try to demonize the country in the eyes of the international community.
And, Jason, I'm glad you actually mentioned the issue of Hong Kong, because I was just about to point that out as well. It seems to me, like you said, that, it is the U.S. is trying to basically engage China in different places, be it Hong Kong, be it the Taiwan Strait, the territorial waters, the issue. I'm thinking that they also do not see that out of favor, that maybe this issues will also spill over to the issue of the territorial dispute that Taiwan has with China. What do you think about this?
I mean, of course, it's going to come out there. I mean, Taiwan is a very close ally and was almost basically created by the United States following the Communist Revolution in 1949. The leader of the Nationalist Party, Chiang Kai-shek, evacuated the country to Taiwan and had the U.S. Navy essentially provide protection for him to surround Taiwan, which is Chinese territory, and then simply declare it to be a separate country, when very clearly it is the same people. It's the same people all over. It's essentially part of Chinese territory. But because it is so closely allied to the United States, to the point of essentially being a puppet state, also frequently a place used for cheap labor for U.S. companies, the U.S. is going to do whatever they can in order to continue that divide within the country, be that politically, militarily, economically, etc. So this is all part of a larger campaign that the United States is using to undermine China in general. I mean, it's very clear that the two major powers in the world are now China and the United States. China is rising while the United States has been declining for some time now. So what we are seeing is a competition for top spot in the world. And these actions by the United States are, as many people have noted, the lashing out action of an empire which may be coming to an end, or at least is in a very untenable position right now, given that it has surrounded itself by so many enemies, and China quickly rising to take the #1 spot.
And one more thing before you go, Jason. Now that you mentioned, I mean, it's quite obvious. That's a very viable fact, actually, that you said all of that has to be considered within the frame of the economic rivalry that the two powers have right now. But to what extent, given the current situation, do you think that the Chinese intelligence will let the country play in the hands of the U.S.?
I sincerely doubt that. I mean, China has been rising as a power for some time, and you don't get to that position by being a fool. China has played itself very well over the last couple of decades, both militarily, politically, and economically as well. It's very difficult for China to make a mistake like this. However, I do think China will be aggressive in defending its rights over its own territorial waters. I wouldn't personally consider this a mistake. I would consider it a right that any sovereign nation has to defend the territory that rightfully belongs to them, regardless of how the United States attempts to portray it. But I very sincerely doubt that you can trick the Chinese government so easily.
Thank you very much. Those comments by Mr. Jason Unruhe, political commentator as well as analyst out of Ontario via Skype. I appreciate your time, Jason.